Determinants of classical conditioning. In the previous video, we have learned what is classical conditioning. In this video, we will learn what are the determinants or the factors that affect the process of classical conditioning. So, before going to the details, please remember to subscribe this channel. Thank you. Determinants of classical conditioning. Behaviorists have described a number of different phenomena associated with classical conditioning. Some of these elements or factors that involve the initial establishment of the response, while others describe the disappearance of the response. So, the factors that affect the classical conditioning are time relation between stimuli, type of the unconditioned stimuli, then discrimination, extinction, and generalization. The first factor that affect the classical conditioning is the time relations between the stimuli. Here, the first three, the simultaneous conditioning, the delayed conditioning, and the trace conditioning are known as forward conditioning, and there is a backward conditioning. The experimental arrangement of these four procedures are as follows. Simultaneous conditioning. When a conditioned stimulus, that is the sound of the bell, and an unconditioned stimulus, that is food, when it is presented together, it is effective to acquire a conditioned response, but it requires greater number of trial. That is, you need to present the dog the food along with the bell sound several times. Then delayed conditioning. Here the conditioned stimulus, that is the bell sound, precedes the onset of the unconditioned stimulus. The conditioned stimulus ends before the end of the unconditioned stimulus. That is, the bell sound ends before the food is provided. So, it is most effective way of acquiring a conditioned response. Then trace conditioning. Here the onset and the end, the starting and end of the conditioned stimulus, that is the bell sound, it precedes the starting of unconditioned stimulus with some time gap between the two. So a bell sound is given and then after some time with a time gap the food is given. It is effective but it requires great number of trial. Then only the dog can be conditioned. The fourth one is the backward conditioning. Here the unconditioned stimulus, that is the food, it precedes the onset of conditioned stimulus or the bell. It is the least effective way to acquire a conditioned response. That is, it is difficult to get a conditioned response through the backward conditioning process. The ideal time interval. So from these experiments, we have learned that the time relation between the stimuli affect the classical conditioning process. The ideal time between the stimulus, that is the bell sound and the food being presented, is around 1 second. So the time gap should be 1 second. If too long the time gap, then the association will not be made. So we need to provide the conditioned stimuli and the unconditioned stimuli, that the bell sound and the food, if it is together or if it is between the time gap 1 second, then it will be fine. If the time gap in providing these two are too long, then it will be difficult to find an association. To get an association, it will be difficult. Another interesting discovery, it was that the associations are only made if the stimulus is presented before the reward. So if the bell sound is presented before the food, then only the associations are made. That is in backward conditioning. In backward conditioning, what happens is like the stimulus is presented after the food. Here it is found that this type of conditioning is completely ineffective in evoking a response. So, the time relations between the stimulus are important. Another factor that affects the classical conditioning is the type of unconditioned stimuli. In other words, it can be said as the intensity of the conditioned stimuli. More intense if the conditioned stimuli are, then more effective it will be in accelerating the acquisition of conditioned response. The unconditioned stimuli that used in studies of classical conditioning are of two types, and this influences the course of both appetitive and aversive classical conditioning. In appetitive type, for example, eating, drinking, etc. are the stimuli used. According to the researchers, it is slower and it requires greater number of trials. And aversive type, it is a not so pleasant type stimuli. For example, noise, bitter taste, etc. Classical conditioning is established in the aversive type with 2 or 3 trials. That is, it is more effective. The more intense the conditioned stimulus, then it will be more effective and only fewer number of trials are needed for conditioning. For example, intense irritating noise is more effective than a pleasant, slower stimuli. Discrimination. It is the ability to differentiate between a conditioned stimulus and other stimuli. It can be similar that have not been paired with an unconditioned stimulus. So in Pavlov's experiment, what he did is he tested to see if animals could discriminate between the seemingly similar stimuli. First, he presented the animals with a kind of tone of bell, followed by the reward of food. The dogs, they learned to associate that tone with that particular sound with the food. Then what Pavlov did is he used a different tone. It generated limited amount of salivation, but in later time, the animals, they learned to discriminate between the real or the original stimulus and the variations of the stimulus that produced no food. So in that study, a particular sound is presented along with food, and the dogs learned to associate that sound with food. Then similar sound was produced, and at first the dog salivated, but on later time they learned to discriminate between the original stimulus and the variations or other similar stimulus. Next is extinction. It is when the occurrence of conditioned response decrease or it disappear. In classical conditioning, this happens when a conditioned stimulus is no longer paired with an unconditioned stimulus. If a person or animal is not presented with the reward when the stimulus is given, after a few occasions, they will learn to dissociate the relationship between the two. If the food were no longer paired with the bell, what happens? Eventually, the conditioned response, that is the salivation, would disappear. It has been found that the association does not disappear completely as when the expected reward is presented again. The association is re-evoked with what is known as spontaneous recovery. So, in extinction, what happens is like if food is not provided with the bell, then the conditioned response will disappear. And this can be revoked if the reward or the food is presented again. And This is known as spontaneous recovery. The re-evocation of the association is known as spontaneous recovery. Generalization. It is the tendency for a conditioned stimulus to evoke similar responses after the response has been conditioned. This is an important issue in conditioning. Stimulus generalization is the tendency for the conditioned stimulus to evoke the similar response after the response has been conditioned. For example, if a dog has been conditioned to salivate at the sound of a bell, the animal may also exhibit the same response to a sound that is similar to the bell. Nervous household pets, they often fear humans and will seek to either avoid them or meet them with a degree of aggression. Classical conditioning theory suggests that the animal's previous bad experience with an unkind human has taught them to generalize their fear to other people. So that is generalization. Now let's have a quick recap on what we have learned. We have learned the determinants or the factors that affect the classical conditioning. Time relation between the stimuli, then type of the unconditioned stimuli or the intensity of the conditioned stimuli, then discrimination, extinction and generalization. Hope you like this video on determinants of the classical conditioning. Please like, share and subscribe. Thank you and keep smiling.